The classification and definition of linear bit signs that appear to have non-phonographic attributes has been the subject of extensive discussions among sinologists. In retrospect, we may instantly recognize similarities in many of the key features of the categories of non-phonographs proposed by researchers, although they use different descriptive terms. There is a primary group of graphemes, which comprises iconic or non-iconic signs, but also phonetic and syllabic abbreviations and unions of 2 or 3 signs, the monograms, related to persons, animate and inanimate objects. A secondary group of signs includes combinations of non-phonographs with syllabograms, with the latter assisting the additional determination of certain characteristics attested by the former. These are the indicative, modifier, or informative, as I call them, signs. In this case, we are thought to be dealing with abbreviations of a Greek noun or adjective, so as to determine and characterize in various ways a plain sign. From there on, there are numerical and metrical linear bit signs for recording economic activities, including number, weight, and capacity estimates. A last category of signs of this kind are the scribal marks, which are often observed on the tablets, for example, word dividers, check marks, dots. Our inability to find a generally accepted terminology for all these signs as a whole, either ideograms or logograms or sematograms, cannot be overlooked, and it is due to our ethic comprehensions of the linear bit writing system, resulting from earlier and current discussions aimed at defining ideography, logography, and sematography in the linear bit script. The goal of this paper is not to propose a new terminology to solve the problem, but rather to promote an alternative critical view, in contrast to the general belief that linear bit non-phonographs present a standardized interpretative corpus of signs which can be classified under a single terminology. Some crucial parameters which help us with the semantic evaluations of non-phonograms are the number of sites where these signs are attested, the number of scribes who adopted them, and their total occurrence on linear bit tablets. The earliest samples of linear bit script are found in Knossos and are dated to the late Minoan II period, while its use continued in mainland Greece down to the end of the late Helladic 3B period. Throughout this time period, however, the interpretation of non-phonograms remains partial, since any attempt made fails to take into account the implications of the factors of time and the cognitive perception of the all written signs by the tablet writers or the tablet readers. For the purposes of this article, we avoid adopting one particular terminology as being more suitable than others. In general, the linear bit signs with non-phonographic attributes will be designated as ideograms, logograms, or sematograms, or simply non-phonograms. Specific distinction will be made when referring to the term logogram as a word sign, in contrast to signs related to more abstract notions and ideas, like ideograms or sematograms. The term grapheme is used to define the smallest functional unit of the writing system, and the generic terminology non-phonographic signs will also be preferred when we proceed to describe this specific category of graphemes. The iconic graphemes are a significant group of non-phonograms related to animated and inanimated objects, such as personnel, livestock, perfumes, textiles, military equipment, and ceramic vessels. Although some of them are tested repeatedly at different sites, Knossos, Pylos, Thebes, Mycenae, Turin, there are numerous graphemes of this kind limited in context, which appear at just one site or are used sporadically by the scribes of one site. On the contrary, non-iconic graphemes are more widely distributed between sites without a significant isolated samples. Given their diffusion and conventionality, we may conclude that these signs were perceived by the scribes in a more homogeneous way, and their simplified and minimal description is proof of their later formation through a gradual process of schematization and abstraction by the scribes. Several key features from the iconic and the non-iconic graphemes will signify their sematographic value, such as their deployment in a columnar pattern, consistently separated from the phonographic scenery directly opposite them, or the use of numerals and metrical units which act as quantitative determinants to the examined signs. Apart from measured objects and commodities, some signs are also thought to represent a measurement unit per se, or for other materials closely related to them, for example, ceramic vessels for the transport of solids and liquid products. For a different view on this matter, however, Thompson states that there is no reason why logograms, or word signs to be exact, should not appear with numerals. He goes on to add that the restriction of sematograms to counting its measuring context may just be a Mycenaean scribal equivalent of one of Hart's rules, and say nothing about the category to which the signs belong. As convincing as these arguments may seem, there are still unknown parameters which need to be taken into consideration. beginning with the signory representing iconic objects. Their precise rendering is in striking contrast to the abstract form of the so-called non-iconic objects, given that they start at the opposite ends of writing, the ones being naturalistic and the others conventional in shape. We may suppose that different forms could also imply or accompany differences in meaning, of which the linear B readers and writers were aware. Apart from the fact that the abstract signs are undoubtedly later formats of simple graphemes, it's not easy for us to trace the development of their semantic perception. Change from iconic to non-iconic signs could well be related to an analogous shift from their accurate identification to their more generalized perception, especially for some of their qualitative and quantitative attributes, or vice versa. But this is only one theory. In parallel, let us not forget that a great number of iconic graphemes are common at many palatial sites, and therefore their semantic value will have been standardized, either as word signs or sematograms. How these iconic signs were perceived over time and acquired their meaning is rather hard to grasp. What seems to be the least we can agree on is the idea of a main body of iconic and non-iconic signory, which was present in a broader geographical area in Greece, in which a standardized logographic or sematographic value had developed. For all the other, however, regionally attested iconic signs, which have no parallels elsewhere, things are not so clear. Given their low frequency and sporadic use, it would be rational to argue even for individual or secondary signs created ad hoc by the scribes, with their adoption being dependent on the scribes' preferences. If this is the case, then it would be easier to relate the set graphemes to logographic symbols corresponding to words or lexemes, and that would be easy since the Mycenaean tablet writers were pragmatic individuals capable of improvising at any moment, and it would not surprise us to see them employ scribal practices of this kind in order to improve or clarify their recordings. Okay, the syllabic signs used as abbreviation represent another noteworthy group. The acrophonic use of certain syllabograms to produce new non-phonographic symbols is a widespread strategy among linear B scribes, and the widely adopted abbreviations are related to personnel, livestock, agriculture, and military recordings, while we may also observe the existence of graphemes used at a regional level for a limited range of activities, such as the perfume and the textile industry. Having said that, the phonetic abbreviations included in the latter category are quite numerous in topology, but not in frequency, and only a few scribes turn to this practice when it comes to regionally applied acrophonic graphemes, in comparison to the broadly attested abbreviations which were used by a greater number of scribes of lettered officials. With this in mind, the interpretation of acrophonic linear B graphemes as abbreviation for words is easy, especially for the ones surviving in regional contexts. The possibility that some abbreviation functioned as ideograms or sematograms remains an active hypothesis, assuming that the overall acceptance of abbreviation could lead over time to more generic descriptions or function for them. For example, the Mycenaean GE series includes acrophonic abbreviations for words which can also have functions as accounting units for aromatics. That's you can see it on Melena in Mycenaean writing in his work guide to in a volume guide to the linear B. Nonetheless, on current evidence, it is rather difficult to confirm this claim. The same picture emerges from the study of monograms, which represent the unions of 2 to 3 syllabograms into a single sign. These signs are made by a few scribes, occur rarely, and are in vertical sequences, either from top to bottom. For example, arepa means ointment, Mary means honey, dipte means leather, or from bottom up, kanako meaning safflower, or capo meaning fruit. Thus, it is logical to speculate that their arbitrary and not frequent spelling is at odds with a formalized way of writing. Furthermore, none of the monograms appear at more than one site. Despite their syllabographic origin, the combination of graphemes results in a new non-phonographic word sign. There is also the case of the so-called indicative, modifier, or informative signs, considering that a great number of them is attested regionally and not widely dispersed between different Mycenaean sites. It makes more sense to attribute to these signs a logographic rather than a sematographic value. The fact that they appear infrequently on the tablets further corroborates this appraisal, along with the low number of scribes turning to their use, and the lack of conventionality and uniformity in their use makes us doubt whether they could carry a meaning wider than one word. On the contrary, it proves that a few scribes would have created these regional sites to specify the meaning of conventional graphemes, usually comprised of iconic or non-iconic signs. A few ligature graphemes are observed at more than one site that are related to specific sectors of Mycenaean economy, such as livestock, olive oil recordings, perfume, and textile industries. At their core, the resulting sign combinations of these categories are usually related to simple words. Later on, however, maybe some of the auxiliary signs which were adopted by scribes in different locations may well have been perceived more semantically, divested of their primary lexical meaning to express abstract notions. For example, there are the adjuncts pa, meaning paleos of the past year, and persinos of the past year, or za vetero of this year, and nevo, new of this year, in the Knossos AK and D series, which could just be synonymous, but their selective use by the scribes could have also been dependent by unknown semantic parameters. Melena thinks that pa and pe means the same. For example, the past year, and za vetero, and neo again means this year. A third group of non-phonographs are the metrical and numerical symbols for number, weight, and capacity estimates. The basic signature for measurement units is common in all the major palatial sites, Pylos, Knossos, Thebes, Mycenae, and used by all scribes. For example, the sign 118 represents the major unit of the weight system, and the sign 110, the smallest unit of the volume system. Both of them have pictorial parallels, the first a pair of scales, talandon in Greek, and the second a ceramic vessel, which is known as chiathos. The standardization and uniformity in the metric signature stands out in all Mycenaean centers, making it easier to suggest that the firm economic terminology or specific fiscal terms had already been established for them, whether the interest was focused on the object themselves or the quantitative value represented by them. Perhaps the signs which can be more easily regarded as having sematographic attributes are the linear numerical symbols. And in the Mycenaean counting system, there are symbols representing units, tens, hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands. Contrary to the general belief, ideograms and sematograms can be vocalized and consequently be interpreted mentally. And for example, 3 horizontal strokes could ascribe the term 30, triakoda in Greek, but none of the component graphic relates to the morpheme or the lexeme 30%. Instead, we estimate the quantities of tens to find the right number. This clearly includes semantic components to explain numerical symbols rather than word signs. It would be logical to expect a similar treatment of many signs representing ceramic vessels, which could have also been adopted to denote specific quantities of dry and liquid products using their containers as a measurement unit, or even to associate this iconic object with fixed metric terms for which we have no information. There is nothing to object to the idea that this procedure revolves around small parts of speech, such as words, and the expression of the measurement unit would remain lexicentric. In parallel, however, its meaning could be signified and extracted in an abstract way, for example, counting the number of vessels and estimating their weight or capacity. There is also, for example, the word dividers, which comprise another category of graphemes with non-photographic attributes. The divider is a vertical strokes which separates the linear scenery not just into simple but into accentual words. Word dividers are usually placed on the side of the tablet, which is intended for the syllabograms, so as to distinguish them, but they can also divide syllabograms from an ideogram and vice versa, or separate two halves of a word or even two ideograms. Word dividers are also found as the final sign at the end of a recording line. And as a scribal practice, the use of the divider is disseminated widely in the major administrative centers, Knossos, Pylos, Thebes, Mycenae, Turin. They appear in all kinds of texts, with both minor and prolific scribes making use of them. And it is interesting to note that there were also other ways of distinguishing graphemes to signify words, such as leaving free space on the clay tablets or altering the size of the signs. Sometimes dividers are used in combination with the latter strategies. So this raises questions about the semantics applied by these vertical strokes, and if they carry a somewhat different meaning or intention from analogous practice for word determination or separation. If the EU argued recently for an alternative function of the dividers as hyphens. And given that the dividers function was to separate the specific groups of graphemes, what we called words, lexemes, or phrases, we may naturally consider the signs to be purely ideographic or sematographic. But there is also no reason to exclude the possibility of, again, ideograms and sematograms being vocalized and expressing segments of speech equal to words. In this case, we could suggest a direct relation between the vertical stroke and the term pause, comma, stop, or end. The information preserved on the clay documents is not sufficient to enlighten us about the hermeneutical evolution of non-phonograms or to evaluate how specific graphemes were used or perceived. Since linear B was confined to a small group of palatial functionaries who used the script solely for bureaucratic purposes, our knowledge about the scribal practices and characteristics of the writing system is rather one-sided and limited to the short-term economic texts that have survived. Nevertheless, given the long chronological period in which the linear B script developed, 200 plus years, we can speculate on the magnitude of changes that occurred to the semantic content of many signs as time progressed. Alongside this hypothesis, we should probably emphasize the potential of personal intervention made by the literary officials themselves, such as adding their own abbreviations or indicative, modifier, or informative signs next to the more conventional ones, which are widely attested at all sites. When it came to writing, Mycenaean scribes were flexible and adaptive, as attested by the various spellings of particular words, the use of similar abbreviations for different words, or the non-formalized way of writing monograms, upwards or downwards. Why then should we exclude the possibility of additional flexibility with regard to the adoption of certain non-phonograms, as well as the extraction of their inherent meaning? Regional differentiations should not be excluded, given also the evidence for political fragmentations in Mycenaean Greece. For example, the use of adjuncts as indicative or modifier signs seems to have been a frequent practice at Knossos, often employed by a limited number of its scribes. This stands in contrast to the evidence from other Mycenaean sites, where we have far fewer examples of this type of writing, while we have signs ligatured or integrated in other non-phonograms, which was more frequently attested. In this case, the evident preference of scribes at Knossos for using the adjuncts is difficult to assess, but clearly maybe there was an idiosyncratic treatment of this, of what we call these indicative modifier signs, these adjuncts, by them. The scribes' flexibility in writing practices could have facilitated the graphic and semantic evolution of many linear B signs, a rather natural phenomenon that is to be expected in neighboring but independent states. How do we know that monograms attested solely at Pylos were understood by scribes working contemporaneously in Thebes or Mycenae? Could the literate officials increase the variety of iconic graphemes to meet different administrative demands in each kingdom? The high number of iconic logograms or sematograms appearing at only one side is hard to ignore, and even the ones with broader diffusion could have also been subject to divergent interpretations. For example, the linear bigraphic arm for armor could have been used at Pylos to render full military gear, along with protective gear for hands and feet, which were not shown, while at Tunis it could have been related to a specific type of armor, for example, cuirass of bronze or of linen cloth. Whether the same symbol was perceived as a word sign or it had acquired a more abstract semantic content from one side to another is also a matter of debate. Following the previous example, arm may have been written to denote the meaning cuirass, full armor, or metal armor, with just one word, for example, thorax or hypothorax in Greek, or express a wider concept, like armor from metal components or main body of armor, without helmet or metal greaves. And that could signify a shift toward more abstract or synthetic meaning. When it comes to writing systems in general, those whose basic functional units correspond to abstract ideas and notions are identified as ideographic. The ones in which the same units are interpreted as words are known as logographic, while those with syllables or phonemes are called syllabographic or phonographic. Having said that, sound and meaning are components utilized equally by all writing systems, which do not rely on one of them only, and the same applies to linear B script. Moreover, we should consider writing and reading as a compromising and pragmatic procedure in which the importance attached to both phonetic and semantic elements differs in each case. One of the basic questions which has preoccupied psycholinguists is how the human mind performs a complex task such as reading. Specifically, do we rely on sign sequences, which we recode and interpret mentally to recognize and reproduce a word, or is the graphemic form related phonologically after it has been originally recognized as a word? And in conjunction with this subject, the impact of repetitive learning and the mental lexicon on this recognition process is decisive. And an experienced person may read by converting graphemes to sounds and human speech before understanding their meaning. But on the other hand, an experienced reader through the mechanisms of repetition and abstract representation, will start viewing the words not as linear sequences of signs, but as single distinctive shapes or graphing sign patterns, if you prefer, which allow the human mind to recover the specific words and meaning. So far, researchers claim that the truth about how people read lies somewhere between these two extremes, and the person may perceive a word by identify its component letters, but also the letters can also be processed simultaneously rather than sequentially. A notable example of a reading strategy are, of course, how word dividers in linear B script, which can be seen as either as a sign or a scribal practice, and how they could facilitate the procedure of reading texts inscribed on clay documents. By defining specific groups of grapheme, it is easier to perceive them as a more abstract composition of written signs, and it is safe to assume that word dividers will play a significant role in helping scribes to recognize frequently recurring and easily identifiable graphic patterns, if you prefer, which correspond to simple words. In these circumstances, even a phonographic script might be approached as a potential logographic script, blurring the boundaries between the two graphic systems. We should also bear in mind that the forces of repetition and abstract perception could equally influence different categories of non-phonograms, either logograms, word signs, or sematograms. Mixed writing systems include signs with a high degree of multifunctionality. The way we associate a non-phonographic sign to a generic notion can be direct, but we may retrieve the same idea through a word sign, or better yet, if you prefer, a keyword, which functions as an intermediate factor guiding us to the right semantic content. Both iconic and non-iconic signs, which are commonly attested at different sites, could be related not just to animate and inanimate objects in linear B, but to specific characteristics attached to them. For example, the S grapheme, which is translated as copper and is usually found together with the word cackle, halkos, copper, in the Pylos JN series. Here we have the practice of double writing, where words rendered with syllabograms are followed by ideograms of the same meaning. Some researchers argue for a deliberate distinction between the descriptive and the ideographic element of an entry. So in the latter case, we may assume that maybe the S sign may reveal special attributes relating to the form or the components of copper. For example, processed copper, scrap, copper alloy, bronze, etc. Even then, we cannot help noticing our weakness in ascertaining the type of writing used by the scribe, whether it was logographic or ideographic in nature. Another example are the signs for ceramic vessels. Different containers could also be used to carry specific quantities of solids or liquids or products in general, or were related intentionally to special features. Therefore, the discrimination between word signs for these vessels and abstract conceptions regarding their content, the weight or volume of their content, their qualities and purposes is rather difficult, with a strong possibility that writers and readers may employ these graphics in many different ways during the creation and consultation of the documents. Even abbreviations and the category of indicative, modifier, or informative signs could function as mnemonic keywords for wider notions and generic observations, which needed to be remembered by the scribes, depending on the number of literate officials having access to the linear B text or the potential scribal conventions promoted by the central administration at its site. The shift between logographic and sematographic interpretation of specific graphemes would have been more fluid and prone to adjustments than we assume. It is also essential to consider the administrative value of linear B documents and how this influences our efforts to determine the use of non-phonographs by the literate officials. The accounting text inscribed in the palatial centers had a short lifespan, lasting a few months based on current evidence, although the period of record keeping could have been even more limited than expected, lasting for a few days or weeks. Due to the lack of crucial information and time references, along with a minimal pinacological, morphological, and scribal standardization, there is considerable doubt regarding the tablet's official character and their importance for third person. Should we add the possibility that these documents constitute personal short-term memoirs, as Killen mentions, we are inclined to believe that there are few firm scribal conventions attached to the non-phonographic signs. In addition, it's hard to identify how reading was practiced inside the Mycenaean palaces and the significance it carried for the literate officials. Bearing in mind the low levels of literacy and the limited reading opportunities, Finlayson proposes that potentially the Mycenaean readers should exactly meaningful documents without necessarily deciphering the whole of the text, or they could have relied on someone else's reading skills.
Since the linear bit documents were temporary mnemonic records, we are inclined to think that the writer of the tablets was also their primary or sole reader, as I proposed. As also Finlayson suggests, the linear bit administrators would have inscribed their tablets knowing that they or their fellow administrators would read their text if the process required. But the important thing is that something was written down without necessarily having any expectation that it will be read. In this case, it would have been easier for the scribe to improvise with the use of the linear bit non-phonographic signs without worrying about any external control of their work. Although scribal interaction would have probably helped maintaining a minimum level of common perception of the work carried out and accessed by different literate officials, individual writing and reading strategies among scribes should not be excluded. The central administration expected scribes to verify and complete several transactions inscribed on the clay documents. Having said that, however, the central administration would have been indifferent to the way in which literate officials applied their writing and reading habits on temporary economic documents. Despite our strict theoretical categorization of graphemes, it is important to remember that in reality, the human mind tends to surpass such linguistic distinctions, focusing its attention on the intermediate zone between phonography and non-phonography, or between the various stages of non-phonography. In our case, we can imagine Mycenaean readers and writers moving in a communicative gray zone where the transition from lexicography to sematography and vice versa is impossible to trace. So we accept this scenario, that we realize also that the semantic categorization of non-phonographs at each site is a rather controversial subject due to the impact of time and human writing and reading strategies on the evolution of the signs. This awaits further study. Thank you.